If you've been following the news, you're aware that recently legislation has been proposed in Congress that will authorize, for the first time in American history, women in combat, at least in certain areas in terms of flying combat missions. This has not passed and has not been enacted into the regulations of various services, but it is something that is being discussed, and it is up for, it is a matter of debate. So it seems that the so-called last bastion of male domination, the military, seems likely, this last bastion seems very likely, increasingly, to split and splinter and to give way under the assault. One commentator this past week somewhat lamented upon this development, and in the process of doing that, he asked a question. His question was, why would so many women trade the best of what it means to be a woman for the worst of what it means to be a man? Now that's sort of an interesting statement, and why would so many be so willing to trade the best of what it means to be a woman for the worst of what it means to be a man? I would like to propose an answer to that question this afternoon. Would like to explore with you both the question itself and the answer from a biblical standpoint. Now, when we look at the willingness to make a trade, anytime you talk about the willingness to trade one thing for something else, obviously, when you trade something, it is because you think you're on the verge of making a good deal. How many of you set out to trade something with the intention of making a bad deal? How many people, have a really good car, and so what they want to do is to get a bad car, so they look for somebody to trade. They want to go down and they want to trade. Well, that doesn't generally happen. Normally, if somebody's going to trade, you're going to trade cars, you're going to trade this, you're going to trade anything. If you trade, it's because you feel like that this is going to be good, this is going to be advantageous, that somehow you're going to trade something that isn't of as much value for something that is good. And this is normally the reason people make a trade. So if so many women in our society are willing to make a trade that is done in the name of, in some cases, women's lib or equal rights or however you want to describe it. They're willing to make that trade. It is because somehow, some way, they're convinced that what they are losing is not of nearly so much value as what they stand on the verge of gaining. In other words, they have accepted the belief that the only values that really count are masculine values. Now that belief is based on a lie, and I would like to explore a little bit who the author and who the author of that lie is, and the source of that lie, and from whence it comes. There is a being in the universe who is the most frustrated individual, the most frustrated being in the entirety of the universe. This is a being who is described in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. He is a being that became very discontented with his lot in life, with his circumstance. Now in Romans 9:20, the Apostle Paul poses the question, shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why have you made me thus? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why have you made me thus? It's like the vessel addressing the potter and saying, why did you make me this way? Why didn't you make me a lamp? You made me a pot, or you made me a pitcher and I wanted to be a bowl. I wanted to be something else. Well, obviously it's ludicrous in the sense of an inanimate object, but Paul's analogy is that God is the potter and we're the clay. And that there is a problem that comes when we are dissatisfied with that which is fundamental to us, when we become dissatisfied with what God has done. Now, the source of dissatisfaction with God goes back to the very first being who was dissatisfied with God and was dissatisfied and who in effect said, "Why have you made me thus?" That being is described in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, and Isaiah 14 he is called by name as Lucifer. Lucifer, which is translated from the Hebrew word that was his name, which meant light bringer. He was to be a light bringer. He was to be a source of knowledge, a source of information. He was to be a source of light. But he became the bearer of darkness. Now the problem started out, we're told in those verses, we're told in Ezekiel 28, for instance, this being was created with great wisdom and beauty, that he summed up wisdom and beauty. He was not only excelled in terms of mental capacity and ability, but he was a very beautiful being. He was a very powerful being. But this creature, this being, became very dissatisfied because he was dissatisfied with his place, with his position. We're told in Isaiah 14:13 that he said in his heart, "I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." He was dissatisfied with being who and what he was. He wanted what God had. He failed to value and appreciate what he had because he wanted what God had. He desired God's office and God's authority. He had no valuing, no appreciation. We're told in Ezekiel 28 that he is described as one of the two anointed cherubim who covered. Now, when you go to the descriptions in the book of Exodus and other places, the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat that was described as symbolic of the very throne of God, that symbolized and represented the throne of God, we have on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the seat or the cover for the Ark of the Covenant was called the mercy seat. And on it were, at each end, were two beings that were carved in gold, called two cherubim, and their wings spread out and covered the mercy seat. And this was symbolic of God's throne, of two great archangels, two great cherubim, who were there right at the very throne of God. We're told in Ezekiel 28 that this being, Lucifer, was one of the anointed cherubim who covered. Was one of the covering cherubim. An individual of great power, of great note, of great authority. An individual who carried and exercised great authority in the government of God. An individual that was placed on the earth, in charge of the earth, administered the earth. Other scriptures, Revelation 12 and other places, indicate that at least 1/3 of the angels were under his jurisdiction. So here was a being who seemingly had everything. He had power, he had position, he had wealth, he had intelligence, he had beauty, but he didn't have what God had. And he didn't like it. He wanted what someone else had and could not value and appreciate what he had. So he became very dissatisfied with his circumstance. And he rebelled. Now, one of the things that he was very dissatisfied with was that the destiny of the angels, as we're told in the book of Hebrews, that the angels are created to be ministering spirits, sent forth to minister unto the heirs of salvation. They are servant spirits. Their very destiny is to serve the heirs of salvation. Now, they were not destined to become a part of the very family of God, to become heirs of God in the sense that we are. You see, Satan hates God and God's plan and God's purpose. He hates mankind and he hates the family. Now, there are reasons why. He hates God's plan because he knows that in God's plan that there are beings that will ultimately receive what he coveted. He hates mankind because he sees creatures made of matter who are destined to be transformed into spirit and to ultimately have a destiny even above his. He hates mankind because he hates the destiny that we have. He hates God's plan. He hates the family because he recognizes that the family is a type, it is representative of the very plan that God has in mind. You see, the family is unique to human beings in terms of the created world. The angels don't have family. Family doesn't exist on the angelic level. We're told in the Gospels that the angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. The angels aren't involved in that. The angels do not establish families. Animals don't establish families. They reproduce, they multiply, but they don't have families. There is not that family connection to past and future generations, that sense of continuity of family. That doesn't exist in the animal world. There is not that sense of family. Family does not exist in the angelic realm. Family exists exclusively on the human level. Well, I say exclusively, not entirely exclusively, because family also exists on the divine level. Our relationship with God is a family relationship, and the human family is given to us as a type of and to prepare us for a part in the kingdom of God, in the very family of God. So Satan the devil absolutely hates everything connected with the plan and purpose of God. He hates God's plan, he hates mankind, and he hates the family. Because those things remind him of what he can never be and can never have. Because he, as we're told in the book of Jude, the angels which kept not their first estate. They did not keep, they did not appreciate and value and love and cherish that which God had designed them for. They did not value and cherish their first estate. They have reserved to them nothing. They have reserved to them, as Jude says, the blackness of darkness forever. Wandering stars, cut off. To whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. A miserable fate. It talks about them gnashing out their own shame because the frustration that will boil forth. Well, that frustration is there, and Satan is called by various names. God changed his name from Lucifer to Satan. Satan means the adversary, because he's no longer Lucifer, the light bringer. Lucifer is actually is not the Hebrew term. It is a Latin translation of the Hebrew word, but it means the same thing. It means light bringer. God changed his name from light bringer to adversary, because that's what he became. And he also is called in the book of Revelation Abaddon and Apollyon. Abaddon is the Hebrew and Apollyon is the Greek, and they both mean the same thing. They mean the destroyer. So here is a frustrated being who seeks to destroy. And he seeks to convey the frustration that he has to anyone and anything that will be receptive to it. Anything that will aid in destroying mankind, the family, the plan of God, because those things are very much intertwined. The very opposite, you see, of a sense of frustration is a sense of acceptance and appreciation. Satan did not accept and appreciate his role. He did not accept and appreciate, as Lucifer, he did not accept and appreciate the role, the position, the state to which he had been called, that for which he was designed and that which was designed for him. He had no acceptance of that, nor did he have an appreciation for it, and as a result he became greatly frustrated. When something is not used for the purpose for which it was designed, then there are going to be problems. If you go and buy a piece of equipment, you buy a tool, to the extent that you use that tool for the way it was designed, it'll work fine. You'll be happy with it. You take something that was designed to do one thing and you try to use it for something else. You get a little small, maybe a little small drill that works just great to put holes in plywood or a little light lumber. You know, it's a little small, lightweight drill, works great to drill holes in lumber, but maybe you've got some plate steel and you need some holes in. Well, you're going to have problems. You may burn up a motor trying to do that because it's too lightweight, wasn't designed for that. Can't do that. You have to use the proper equipment. You try to use something for that for which it was not intended and doesn't work nearly so well. Frustration is the result. Satan has sought to sow frustration. He has sought to engender destruction by the lie that has engendered so much frustration and so much unhappiness and so much destruction ultimately on the human level and in the context of the human family, and that is the lie that the only values that are important, the only values that count, the only things that really have value are masculine values. Now that's a lie. And the authority on which I label it a lie is God's Word, because God says that that's not true. In fact, if you want to find out a little bit of the kind of relative value God attaches to things, you might just notice very briefly in Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 10, it says, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies." Now, if you want to attach a value to something, God says that the value of a virtuous woman is greater than the value of rubies. Now, that's pretty important. That's pretty valuable. It sounds like to me that God didn't agree with the devil and didn't agree with some of the modernist sentiment that the only things that have value or the only things that count are masculine values, and that which is feminine doesn't really count for anything. God says that a virtuous woman, her price is far above rubies. Now, in ancient times, the way they used to determine value, the way they would weigh things out, and they would attach weight, and they used a balance scale. Well, now I'll tell you what: if you took a virtuous woman and put her on one end of the balance, it'd take an awful lot of rubies to balance the scale. That sounds like to me that's something God says is pretty valuable. In fact, it is beyond calculating in terms of value. It is of such a virtuous woman is of such immense value that it's beyond being able to set any sort of monetary value. Now that, of course, is a concept. That is a way of thinking that is very much contrary to a lot that is common today. But what is common today is not something that just simply came on the scene without any prior history. Because the attack on the family, ultimately the attack on femininity, the attack on the feminine role is an attack on the family. It is an undermining and a destructive influence on the family, and it's waged by those who ultimately hate the family. They don't recognize the source of their motivation, but Ephesians tells us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against principalities, against wicked spirits in high places. Ultimately, our contest, our battle, is a spiritual battle against Satan, the devil, and his minions, those that are his fallen angels. So, there is a battle that is being waged, there is a battle going on, but it is not simply on the human level, but it is one that we have to understand, we have to recognize, and the attack on the family didn't just start yesterday. It has been around for a long time. In the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul makes an interesting statement, talking here about the philosophers that had shaped the thinking of the Greco-Roman world. The philosophers really whose ideas, whose theories, whose thoughts, whose writings have given rise to a lot of what we consider very modern. I'm going to prove that to you in a few moments because I want to read some quotes that reach back almost 2,500 years. You will find that there are a lot of things that there's nothing new under the sun. The Apostle Paul, speaking of certain of these individuals, the men such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, who gave shape to, who gave definition to the Greco-Roman world and its value system, Paul was not real impressed with these individuals and the conclusions to which they came. He said in Romans chapter 1 verse 18, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold back the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. The invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness, through the lusts of their own heart, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who's blessed forever. For this cause God gave them up to vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet or fitting. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, a mind devoid of judgment. God gave them over to a mind devoid of judgment. Now, one of the great philosophers who shaped the Greco-Roman world was a man by the name of Plato. Plato was the student, the disciple of Socrates. He was the teacher of Aristotle. Now, Plato had some interesting things to say. He wrote a book entitled The Republic. Now, this book, The Republic, was sort of a utopian scheme of the perfect society. Now, you may wonder what that has to do with any of us, but you see, Plato's utopian scheme laid out in the Republic became the basis of much of Karl Marx's writings and much of the things that shaped the thinking of Karl Marx. And I'm going to read you some quotes from Plato. And the book that I'm reading from was actually translated and written itself back in 1917. So is up to date and as modern as some of these things seem. Even the English author who wrote this was writing before the history of the 20th century had unfolded, before there was a Soviet Union, before any of these things. And some of the parallels, some of the things are rather remarkable. But he had a scheme, a utopian scheme, to create this perfect society. Now, the problem was that this society, this socialist utopian society, got rid of the things that stood in its way, the things that Plato viewed that were going to have to be eliminated. If you created utopia, you'd have to eliminate private property and you'd have to eliminate the family. He looked at those things as the obstacles. to creating really a complete, total authoritarian state. The utopia that Plato had in mind was created in this century. It was known as the Soviet Union and other people's republics, those utopias have long since gone sour. Sort of interesting. You see, the world tends to vacillate. The theories that have been extant, Plato's theories was a statist theory. In other words, an authoritarian, the state is supreme. All of the, whether Nazism or communism, any of these isms that are really a statist mentality. The supremacy, the ultimate is the state. Everything is to be controlled by, done for, on behalf of. The ultimate value is the state. And everything is to be sacrificed for that. And that is the ultimate. And this, of course, is the way of thinking that Plato outlined, and it's the way of thinking that has shaped all of the totalitarian philosophies that have so much influenced this 20th century. Now, the opposite of that is another way of thinking that was also advocated by certain of the Greek philosophers, which is the excessive individualism, which kind of boils down. That's sort of the thinking of democracy. But that boils down to sort of an every man for himself, every man out for what's in it for me, the ultimate individualism sort of an approach. You see, these represent two extremes. Ultimately, this excessive individualism, if everybody's out for himself, nobody's doing what he needs to do, which means that a lot of things go undone, so it winds up going around full circle and coming back to a statist sort of setup where the state controls everything because individuals are not. You can have an excessive emphasis on the state or an excessive emphasis on the individual. Interestingly enough, God's set up in society, if you look at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and ancient Israel, what you had was a family-based society where the primary emphasis was on neither the state nor the individual, but on something in between. It was on something in between. It was a balanced perspective. It was a set of family-oriented values, and anything else can be destructive of that. Now, Plato used as a model for his ideal republic, for his utopia, he used as a model the Greek city-state of Sparta, which was a very militaristic state. When you read some of the descriptions of Sparta, it sounds like Stalin's Soviet Union. And it's amazing the parallels, some of the things that, because even some of the more extreme experiments that Stalin sought to carry out, including the abolition of the family back shortly after the revolution, certain things that just were such abysmal failures that they finally had to give it up. But Plato used Sparta as the model, though he got some ideas from Athens as well. But in his mind, one of the biggest problems with Athens was that in Plato's eyes, that which was of supreme importance to the state was left to the family. Now, what was that? That was the issue of education. And it goes on to say here, in reaction against the control of the family over education, Plato goes to the length of abolishing the family altogether. He didn't want the family to have any control over education. Now that's sort of modern 20th century. That sounds like some of our, if you've had any dealings with some of the school boards and some of the school administrators, you realize there are an awful lot of people who sort of subscribe to the philosophy that they don't want the family to have any control over education. They don't realize that way of thinking goes back to Plato and Sparta. It doesn't go back to the Bible. But Plato, in Spartan history, there had developed, and for centuries was maintained, a rigorous system of state training. The Spartan youth was taken from his parents at the age of 7, and his education was entrusted to an official of the state. Now, we've made progress since those primitive days. We now take them far younger. We've come up with nursery schools and kindergartens and all sorts of things that we don't even leave them until they're 7 anymore. Don't think that there's not an agenda that is hidden behind trying to sort of dangle these things out and increase the government funding until ultimately what is created in a sort of roundabout way is complete state control and indoctrination of a generation, because that's the way to control the future, to shape the next generation. I think many of us, and this is one of the fundamental areas of child rearing, many of us do not realize the extent to which a totally alien value system, alien to the Bible, a totally alien value system is indoctrinated in our children from early age. And it's done in a subtle way. It's not that every teacher is consciously opposed to that, but whether you're looking at everything from the educational materials to television to so many things, there is an anti-biblical, anti-Christian bias that underlies and that permeates so much. Well, Plato's concept was this Spartan idea, taking children away from the parents and trusting them to an official estate. At Sparta, the family had no control over the education of its members. The state was all in all. Now that, again, this was considered pretty radical back in when this author, this English author, was writing about it back in 1917. He thought some of Plato's ideas were pretty radical. If he just lived a few more years, he would have seen them in action. He goes on talking about the reordering of Plato's society, and Plato's reordering of society. It says, women as well as men, if in a less degree, were subjected to the rigors of the system. The life of the family was subordinated to its needs, and the home had no place in a state where husband and wife were forbidden any real marital communion, and children left their parents as soon as infancy was over. So he goes on, he says these are all features which recur in the Republic, of which in many respects Sparta is obviously the model and the inspiration. He goes on to showing how even in Athens, there was a political faction that really admired and was in Sparta, really impressed with that, especially among the upper classes, and a Spartan pose was sedulously cultivated, especially in the relations of elder men with boys. Now, the footnote is that it was a feature of the Spartan system which threw men and boys together, that it encouraged rather than prevented the vice that was called in Greek and called in English today by that same name, pedestry. It simply is homosexual relationships between older men and younger boys. We usually term it child abuse. That was very, very common in the ancient Greek world. It created this artificial setup. See, that's what Paul described in Romans 1 when he talked about leaving the natural use, women leaving the natural use, men doing the same thing, God giving them up to vile affections. This sort of perversion that became very much characteristic in the Greek world. This sort of thing was advocated and was utilized. Plato's aim was to combine the curriculum of Athens with the organization of Sparta. Well, let's go on. I want to just read you a few more things. Plato's scheme not only embraces community of property, it also contemplates community of wives. He went on and said that he wished the rulers of his ideal state to be troubled neither by distractions from their work nor by temptations to self-interest. He deprived them of property because the care of it was a distraction and the desire for it was a temptation. His aim was only half achieved with the abolition of property. The family postulates property for its maintenance. It is a distraction from the genuine work of a man's life, which is service to the state. It is a temptation to throw oneself into self-seeking. So, the advocacy of a community of wives occupies a much larger proportion of the argument of the Republic than the advocacy of the community of property. Plato recognized that property and the family are interdependent facts. The most thoroughgoing modern socialists equally recognize that socialism, which means a revolution in property, must also involve a reformation of the family. In Sparta, women shared to some extent in the training of men. There was little family life. Wives might be lent by their husbands to produce children for the service of the state. Goes on a little further. Contrary to the Athenian practice, Plato sought to remove education from the control of the family, give it into the hands of the state. To Plato, the home was only a stumbling block. Another thing Plato did, he drew all of his conclusions by analogy from the animal world. He figured that he could understand everything about people by looking at animals because, after all, we're only animals. Which, of course, is the way the modern evolutionists think. They're real modern. They've gone back 2,400 years ago and finally gotten as smart as some of the things come up with Plato's reasoning. He denies on this basis that there's any difference in kind between man and woman. If woman differs from man in sexual function, that's all. That's the only difference. She's in all other functions of life simply a weaker man. She's just a man, except she's not quite as strong, has different sexual functions. So if Plato aims at emancipating women from the bondage of the household, it is only in order to subject them again to the service of the community at large. If you go back and you read the history of the Soviet Union, Lenin promised equality to all the women, and they found out what that meant. When he took power, it meant that he put them out in the fields, he put them in the factories, he put them doing man's work. He put them out there doing the things, plowing and working 12-hour days, and drafted the men, conscripted them, and treated them just as brutally as he did the men. So that was what he meant by equality, it's sort of like... if you want total equality, if you want complete equality and security, there's a place where everybody's on the same level and they all are provided for. We have several facilities here in Louisiana, the largest of which is Angola. Of course, you don't have any freedom. But you got food to eat and place to sleep. You've got the various needs provided. You have all decisions made for you. Everybody can wear the same uniform and sleep on a bed of the same size and go through the same chow line. No great disparities of wealth and all of that. Well, that of course is sort of what became in Plato's utopia. If he aims at emancipating women, I've read that. It's for reasons of state that he desires the emancipation of women. If women are trained to perform the lighter labors of the state, things that are physically less demanding, the service of the state will gain new instruments and will thus be discharged more efficiently. Another thing he goes on to do, to produce a good stock of citizens, the state must act on the same principle. It must supersede monogamy at will by communism under supervision. The men and women live together in common barracks, discharge their duties in common. They would naturally have intercourse with one another. Now, Plato figured this out. That's what would happen, all right. The Navy didn't figure it out. They recently had to discharge 20 women from a ship over in the Persian Gulf who had become pregnant on board ship. But it took a government commission to come to this conclusion. You see, it is a court-martial offense for fraternization and sexual relations among personnel there on ship. So it took a government commission to come to the conclusion that the fact that there were 20 of them pregnant was not that there was no proof that they had been fraternizing with the men on board ship. You would have to be a government bureaucrat to conclude that 20 pregnant women sailors did not necessarily mean they'd been fraternizing with the men. Well, I don't know what it proved, but anyway, the government couldn't figure that out. They'd stick them all together, and sure enough, that's what was going to happen. Well, Plato knew that was what was going to happen, and he desired to sort of create a master race by selective breeding. Hitler also read Plato and took inspiration from the Republic, but Plato had a solution. So he knew that in the way he had things set up, there was going to be a lot of sexual promiscuity. So he said, if intercourse takes place this way, the offspring should simply not see the light. Or if it does, should be put to death. In other words, abortion or infanticide. He advocates procuring of abortion when intercourse is taking place outside the prescribed limits of age, and in certain cases he advocates infanticide. So Under the whole scheme of communism, whether in respect of property or in respect of marriage, there lies the assumption that much can be done to abolish spiritual evils by the abolition of those material conditions in connection with which they are found. Now, this is almost quoted verbatim by Marx and some of the communist philosophers. The whole point is that the sort of statist concept, the idea of undermining the family, the idea of undermining masculine and feminine roles, is something that is not new or unique to the latter 20th century. It's not unique to the 20th century at all. It was being advocated, as long ago as 400 BC by Plato, when Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. That was what he meant. That which has been is that which shall be. Well, the Apostle Paul describes that in Romans chapter 1, describes the line of thinking and describes what has happened. Ultimately, there is a set of values that is promulgated that is a false set of values. A set of values that places priority on the wrong things. A set of values that is false. That says the only things of value are things that God does not agree with. God says of a virtuous woman, her price is far above rubies. But the willingness to trade, the reason why so many seem so quick to be willing to trade the best of what it means to be a woman for the worst of what it means to be a man, is because they believe the lie, Satan's lie, that the only values that are important, the only things that really count, are masculine values. Now, what is the best of what it means to be a woman? God created Adam and Eve. He created man and woman. He created the first man, the first woman, and with them created the first family. Now, God creates for a purpose. There is a design. In Genesis chapter 2, we read that in verse 7, God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The man became a living soul. God planted a garden and put the man in it. And we're told that in verse 18, the Eternal said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him." I'll make him a help that's exactly compatible. I'll make him a companion to help him. I'll create someone who will be designed to interact with him, to serve as a companion, to serve as a help. And out of the ground, the eternal God had formed all of the creatures, and He brought them to Adam to see what He would call them, and Adam named them. And Adam gave names to all the cattle and to the fowl and everything else. But for Adam, there was not found a help meet for him. There was no companion for Adam. There was a void. There was an emptiness. It's not good that the man should be alone. God did not create us to exist in isolation. Now, the family is the fundamental unit of the community. That does not mean, by the way, that the only way to have value, the only way to please God, is that every single human being has to marry and have children. That obviously has never been the case exclusively. That is the norm. That is obviously what occurs most of the time. There are a variety of reasons as to why in some individual cases that may not occur, and there are certainly individuals, both male and female, who are mentioned in the Bible, who never married, even though the community in which they lived was defined and delineated by family values, and the family set the whole tone and tenor and definition of the community, and yet there were individuals, whether men such as John the Baptist or others of whom you might think, women, take for instance Mary and Martha, who are the sisters of Lazarus. They clearly were not married at the time Christ knew them. They were living with their brother, and the three of them living together. There is no indication from secular tradition that they ever married. The indication is that rather that they did not. The point that I make is that in an emphasis on the family and on the importance of family and on the role for which God created us, that in no way is meant to be a total statement of saying that the only way for any man or any woman to have value is that they have to marry. That obviously is the norm. That is what occurs most of the time. That is what has occurred most of the time. But there are a variety of reasons for which there may be individual exceptions. But the point is, God created man and then He created woman. And He made the woman for the man as a help, as a companion. He not only created the woman for the man, He created the woman from the man. He allowed Adam to become aware that there was no one to help him, no one to keep him company, no one to share his life. And then He caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and while he slept, He took one of the ribs, closed up the flesh instead thereof, and the rib which the Lord God took from man, He made a woman, and He brought her to the man. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." Now, there's a play on words in the Hebrew. The word for man is ish, the feminine ending in Hebrew. The fact that together they constitute mankind. One is feminine, one is masculine. Therefore, God said to Adam, "Shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So God established marriage, God established the family at the institution of creation, at the beginning of creation, at the time when man and woman were created. And woman was not created as an afterthought. She was created as a very important part of the creation. We're told God made them. God created man in His own image, male and female created He them. So God made mankind in His image, in His likeness, and mankind was created as male and female. And for a very important reason. God emphasized certain aspects, certain characteristics in each. And that gets back to the intrinsic identity of human beings. That identity is male and female. Down through the centuries, it is proven, it is demonstrated in the pages of the Bible as well as in the pages of secular history that the wife, the mother, just as truly as the husband has been intended by God to be the head of the home, that the wife, the mother, is the heart of the home. This is shown that you can exemplify it through various scriptures, examples in the scripture as well as through examples from secular history. Women have had a softening, nurturing, civilizing effect on culture, a refining, elevating influence. Proof of that is all you've got to do is go out to a men's hunting camp, where some men are off on a deer hunt or something for a few days, and there's no woman's touch anywhere around. And you realize how quickly things degenerate when a woman isn't around. Everything from the table manners to just the whole works. And any of you guys who've been off on an all-male hunting trip or camping trip and maybe a deer hunt or something for a few days, or whether it's or other contexts, you realize the extent to which it is true that women have a softening, civilizing effect. They have a refining, elevating effect on civilization. That's their influence. And it is a very vital and a very important influence. And it is an influence that God intended to be there. And yet, unfortunately, there have been those increasingly in our society who have bought in to Satan's big lie and who have increasingly experienced frustration because of a belief that the values and the ways, the things that were characteristic of their very femininity were things of second-rate value, things not as important as something else. In Proverbs chapter 31, when Solomon is inspired by God to discuss the subject of a virtuous woman, says, "Who can find a virtuous woman who prices far above rubies? The heart of her husband does safely trust in her." Now, that's one of the characteristics. First thing we find here, the relationship that exists is a relationship based upon trust. She was created to be his companion, his friend. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. At the very basis of every healthy relationship is trust and respect. When trust and respect are damaged or destroyed, a relationship ceases to be healthy. A relationship is sick and diseased. A healthy relationship grows. A sick relationship decays and dies. Trust and respect are at the basis of healthy relationships. Speaking of a virtuous woman, she is first and foremost described as one in whom her husband can safely trust. Not just that he does trust her, but she is one in whom he can safely trust. Trust in his heart. So here is a very important concept. The importance of something that underlies the friendship, the companionship, all of the things that are there. You see, he can trust her because verse 12 says she will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. There's a basis for his trust. His trust is not misplaced or misguided. It is not a trust that's based on illusion. Because her desire, her intent, her practice is to do him good, not evil. She's not going to undermine him in public or in private. She's going to do him good. She's going to help him. She's his friend, his companion, the one with whom he can walk through life, the one in whom he can safely trust. She's industrious. She works hard, just as he does. Says that she does not eat the bread of idleness. In other words, that is characteristic here that, as it says in verse 27, she looks well to the ways of her household, eats not the bread of idleness. You know, she's not laying around from morning till night, watching the soap operas and doing all the things that just sort of waste the day. That doesn't mean she never relaxes or she never sits down or she never does something of a relaxing nature. That's not what it's talking about. But it's talking about someone who is productive, someone who accomplishes things, and her emphasis in verse 27 is looking well to the ways of her household. She is home-centered. She is home-focused. She's focused in on the household and on the home and on her husband and on her children and on the needs of the household and making sure that these are met. You know, what's going to happen if the husband is wrapped up in going out and pursuing his job and his wife is wrapped up in making a living and her life is wrapped up in going out and making a living, and neither of them are wrapped up in the home and in the ways of the household. It's not that she is incompetent and incapable. She's described here, and some of the things that she does certainly described in the context of even an economic impact on the family. It has to do with things that focus upon and that center on the home. It's not a matter of her lacking judgment or even lacking business acumen. In verse 16 of chapter 31, it describes her ability to consider a field and to buy it, to do so for the purpose of planting a vineyard. So she is certainly one in whom her husband can trust. She's one that is capable. She's one that works hard. but she has a set of priorities and values that are home-centered. Verse 21 says she's not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She's taken care of that. She's seen after that. She's made sure that clothes are properly obtained or mended or whatever needs to be done. She looks after her own clothing, that it is nice. Her husband is a responsible individual who sits with the elders of the land. So she is together with her husband. She and her husband make up a team. This is obviously what is described is an idealized portrait that is here, but it describes characteristics and it describes things that relate to value. A virtuous woman whose place is above boobies. There is a set of values that is described. There is a role for which God intended and designed women. A role that is increasingly being lost sight of in our modern society. We live in a very materialistic society. We live in an increasingly statist society, a society that has, frankly, both of the extremes of the statism that Plato espoused, as well as the extremes of individualism that others espouse. And what gets squeezed out in the middle is the family. Squeezed out by the state from one end and by excessive individualism from the other. Because the family involves commitment, it involves sacrifice for others in the family, it involves something that is bigger and broader than the self. Because when the whole world revolves around self, and that's the only thing we take into consideration, our world becomes very, very small. In the book of 1 Timothy, the Apostle Paul discusses some things that have to do with what it means to be a woman and with the values that are to be exemplified. And in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8, verse 8, he sort of sets the stage. He says, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Now, he addresses the subject of men and talks about the relationship of man with God, and the fact that if we're going to lift up our hands in prayer to God, that they need to be holy. In other words, they shouldn't be polluted by all sorts of dirty, filthy actions. They shouldn't be polluted by doing all of the wrong things without wrath and doubting. So an attitude, our actions and our attitude play a very important part in setting the stage for an effective prayer life. In like manner also, verse 9, in like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with blooded hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becomes women professing godliness with good works. Now, Paul addresses something. He discusses a way of exemplifying a way of thinking. He talks about the fact that the way that we present ourselves should reflect the way we are and the way we think. Now, he mentions three categories in verse 9. He talks about women adorning themselves with modest apparel. And he talks about adorning in two ways. One has to do with modest apparel. One has to do with what you put on. And that, he says, is to be modest. In other words, it's not to be something that is provocative, not to be something that calls the wrong sort of attention. It is to be modest apparel. That would certainly mean that it's appropriate for the occasion. It means that, skirts are not too tight or too short or that necklines aren't too plunging or all of the various ins and outs and tabs and all the things that have come by. It doesn't seek to delineate a list of 20 criteria It just says modest apparel. Clothing that is appropriate, that is modest and feminine. So one has to do with what we put on. It has to do with modest apparel. And then the term shamefacedness, which is a little bit of an awkward translation because it is an old English word that the connotation of which in English, modern English, sounds like has a sort of a negative sound, something that people think of, someone who wants to go off and hide somewhere. And that's not what it's talking about. It doesn't mean that at all, but it has to do what the Greek word that's rendered shamefacedness here means is a modest demeanor. In other words, the look that reflects modesty. What is put on is one, the clothes that reflect modesty, modest apparel. The next has to do with a modest demeanor. Now, where is our attitude and our state of mind? Where are our feelings, our emotions? Where are our thoughts expressed? You know, if you want to know how somebody feels or how what they're thinking, when you want to communicate with them, you don't look at their elbows. You look at their eyes, their mouth. You look at their face. That's the part of a human being that is expressive. You don't, that's the part. You don't look back at somebody's head. That's not the part that's expressive. Elbows aren't expressive, but the face is expressive. That's the part of a human being where we express what we are thinking and feeling on the inside. The eyes most of all, the mouth secondarily. It has to do with an attitude that shines out. A modest demeanor may be the best way of rendering it. The term that's used here, the word in the Greek language, eidos, A-I-D-O-S, that is translated shamefacedness, it's a word that is not used in that sense. That is the root word, but it's not used in that. It's not used very frequently in the Greek language. Most of the time it is only used in the negative form in Greece, which may say something about some of what the Greeks had, but it's usually used in a negative form, anidos, which means not modest demeanor. When it's translated into English in that way, it's translated as brazen. So the very opposite of modest demeanor is a brazen demeanor. In the old expression, brazen hussy. You don't hear that expression much anymore, but it is the opposite of that is expressed here. One has to do with so we're looking at a way of putting forth ourselves. So it says modest apparel with shamefacedness or with modest demeanor, a look of the face that reflects that inner attitude, and sobriety. So one has to do with, two of the three have to do with the way that we present ourselves, the way that we reflect that inner attitude that is translated sobriety here, simply means a sensible approach, a modest, sensible approach to life that will be reflected in the cut of our clothes and the look on our face. If you were to pick up some of the women's glamour magazines, you could illustrate the very opposite of what Paul describes right here. You just simply can. All you got to do is walk through a supermarket and just look. And you look at the poses that are exemplified. Look at the expressions that are there. Look at the whole thing. You can at least start with an idea of the opposite of what God wants, because there's no way you can look at most of those covers of what are called models. Well, what are they modeling? They're not modeling modest apparel, modest demeanor, and a sensible, modest attitude toward life, but rather the opposite. So Paul talks about those things which become women professing godliness with good works. He talks about an inner way of thinking that is reflected in the way that we present ourselves to the world, properly feminine, with an emphasis on modesty, on respect, on appropriate behavior. Then, in verse 11, he gets into what is undoubtedly one of the women's libber's favorite verses in the Scripture. let the women learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness with sobriety. Now, what is this talking about? It's talking about the order of society, the state of things in the church in terms of the ordering of church services and the ordering of the way that things were to be set and to be established, the roles that were established. He reminds the fact that God created Adam, then He created Eve. Eve was not in no way an afterthought. She was a companion, but Adam was created to take the lead. And an example in verse 14 is the fact that Adam really was not deceived. The obvious implication, Eve was taken in and she believed the serpent. Adam didn't. Adam simply went against his better judgment to please his wife. She said, here, why don't you take a bite? And he caved in. He knew better and should have been responsible for properly exercising God's government, and his lack of appropriate action resulted in a lot of problems. Now, verse 15 makes a point. The point is that the commentaries are all in confusion on what it means, but it makes a very simple point. The point is that a woman's role, as described in verse 11, 12, 13, 14, a woman's role is different than the role of a man, that a woman who carries out her role in life with faith and love and holiness, with a sober, sensible attitude, will receive salvation just the same as a man who carries out his role in life with the same attitudes. You see, what determines our salvation is not, well, if women can't preach and women can't occupy this particular role in society, then, how will they ever have an important part in God's kingdom? Well, the point that Paul makes is that we all build character by carrying out the role that we have. If you carry out your assigned role in the right attitude and in the right spirit, and you can develop the same spiritual character. The same spiritual character can be built by a man or a woman properly, appreciatively, acceptingly carrying out and fulfilling our God-assigned role. We don't have to covet somebody else's role and think, well, theirs is better than mine. They get it easy, or they get all the glory, or they get this, or they get that. I wish, why shall the thin form say to him that made it, why have you made me thus? Why do I have to be this way? Why can't I be that way? Why can't I be something else? It is a matter of accepting and appreciating and valuing that which God has made us, and realize that there's no such thing as a valueless creation, as one little T-shirt, a little saying sometimes you see that stick with you, a little cartoon of a little kid standing there. It was where I saw it was on a T-shirt, but the caption said, "I know I'm somebody because God didn't make no junk." And the thought that is expressed there is a very important thought. God didn't make junk. Every ethnic group, both male and female, every nationality, every group of human beings, whether it be a grouping based on any of the things that are characteristic of birth, whether it be sex or whether it be ethnic origin, there is no such thing as a second rate, or one that God thinks has value and one that has no value. Rather, if we fulfill our role, if we do the things that we have to do, and do them well, and learn to do them with our heart and mind, exemplifying the attitude of Jesus Christ, we will do it in a way that is pleasing to God. And we'll fulfill our destiny. Our destiny is outlined in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, the latter part of the chapter. In verse 16 it says, "What agreement is the temple of God with idols? You are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I'll dwell in them and walk in them, and I'll be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, says the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God." Learning to become like God. Because God says that if we come out of this world, if we reject the world and its set of false values, if we reject the lies that Satan promulgates, and we adhere to and hold on to and cling and inculcate and make a part of us the truth of God, if we come out of this world and its false values and turn our back on it, not polluting ourselves with the uncleanness of this world, God says, I will receive you. I'll be a father. You'll enter into a family relationship with me, and you'll be my sons and daughters. Sons and daughters. Having these promises, we need to clean ourselves up with the help, the power of the Spirit of God. You know, as we approach Pentecost, we're coming to a festival that focuses in on the church and its role. You know, ultimately, all of us, as a part of the church, are to be a part of what? The bride of Christ. The role that Paul describes in Ephesians 5, the whole relationship of male and female is patterned after the relationship of Christ and the church. So ultimately, these are values that need to be inculcated because as a church, we must emphasize those values. We have a great and awesome call. Satan seeks to thrust his frustration off on any and all. In order to reject the frustrated feelings that he promulgates, we have to reject the lies that he offers. One of those lies is the fact that the only values that count are masculine values. That's false. God made mankind male and female. The nurturing, softening, civilizing, refining, elevating influence of women, wives, of mothers. The virtuous woman. Those values, down through the centuries, are values that God says are of great value, inestimable value, because the value of a virtuous woman is far above rubies. God says, come out of the woman, adhere to me, adhere to my values. Ultimately, I will be your father. You'll be my sons and daughters.